Hi, and welcome to this lecture on sustainable development, definitions and perspectives. My name is Jon-Erik Dahlin. To learn about the subject of sustainable development, of course, you have to learn facts, methods and processes, as with any subject. For example, to understand how the climate works, how economic instruments can be used, what technologies that are being developed and what the living conditions are like in different countries. But in addition to these, two other aspects are equally important: systems thinking and understanding perspectives. In this lecture, we will focus on understanding perspectives, and we will go through a few different proposals for definitions of the concept of sustainable development, which have been brought forward by various organizations. We will also reflect on how different perspectives and different points of view can lead to different ways of looking at this subject. The first difference in perspective that I intend to take up is the difference between ecocentric thinking and anthropocentric thinking. We can reflect on some features of tropical coral reefs to understand this difference. Coral reefs represent extremely rich habitats and ecosystems. They are among the most diverse on Earth. But the world's coral reefs are under threat from a number of angles. This picture shows a reef where corals have died of coral bleaching, a phenomenon that is spreading more and more in the world's coral reefs as a result of changes in the aquatic environment. The situation is alarming. But why? There are essentially two ways of looking at this. From an ecocentric perspective, coral bleaching is alarming because when corals die, many other species also disappear, which means loss of biodiversity. Coral reefs have been on Earth for hundreds of millions of years. And what we humans do by changing the conditions of life are basically to destroy natural systems that will not be restored. The ecocentric perspective puts nature's intrinsic value first. From an anthropocentric perspective, however, coral bleaching is alarming because coral reefs are important rejuvenation places for fish stocks. They serve as nurseries for many species of fish that we eat, and this will have a major economic impact. An anthropocentric perspective puts human values first, and nature can be used to promote human development. Preserving nature becomes a matter of preserving the possibility to use the values that nature generates for us humans. From a philosophical perspective, it is a great difference between these arguments. They put different values first. The ecocentric puts nature first. The anthropocentric puts people's well-being first. The result of both arguments will be the same in this case. Coral bleaching is alarming because it destroys the natural environment which has values to be preserved. In both cases, there are strong reasons to call for nature protection activities. And one might think that it doesn't matter which perspective you have, because the result was the same. In both cases, there are strong arguments to preserve natural systems. But the question is anything but academic. There are many cases where precisely the difference between ecocentric and anthropocentric thinking is the basis for conflict between different groups in society. A good example is the limestone mining in the Ojnare forest on the Swedish island of Gotland. The limestone mining company Nordkalk acquired in 2012 an approval of the environmental court to start mining for limestone in the Ojnare forest. But when the company began felling trees to make way for mining, activists broke camp in the forest to prevent this from happening. The activists pointed out that the forest was worthy of protection because it contains key habitats and several red-listed species, several of which are endemic, which means they are only found there. The police then tried to move the activists from their camp by physical means. The question of mining in the Ojnare forest is a good example of an issue where various groups and organizations did not agree on which action that would lead to the most favorable development. Both sides claimed sustainable development as the reasons for action. In the end, the government decided to protect Oinare as a natural reserve and at the same time investing in industrial business development on the island. It is important to emphasize that neither side is truly right or wrong in this kind of debate. They can actually both be right from their respective perspectives. In this particular matter, perspectives differed exactly because one side took an anthropocentric perspective, while the other took an ecocentric perspective. Another way to categorize different views of sustainability is to talk about 3 shades of green, a division coined by the writer Alex Steffen. Those are called the light greens, bright greens, and dark greens. The light greens see protection of the environment first and foremost as a personal responsibility. They focus on environmentalism as a lifestyle choice. They advocate choosing organic food and to use public transport. Bright greens advocate environmentally friendly technology. Clean energy and clean production will replace current dirty processes. They believe that new technology, better design, and social innovation will allow for a better life in the future for more people, while living within the limits of the planet. Dark greens believe that the environmental problems are an inherent part of the industrialized civilization, and they seek radical political change. Dark greens believe that currently and historically dominant political ideologies, sometimes referred to as industrialism, inevitably lead to consumerism, overconsumption, waste, alienation from nature, and resource depletion. Dark greens claim that this is caused by the emphasis on economic growth. These 3 distinct paradigms of thought show clearly that it is far from obvious how a sustainable development should be achieved. Obviously, one can mean different things when talking about sustainable development. So how can we define the concept of sustainable development so that we all mean the same thing? Or can we? It turns out that different organizations have attempted to define the concept of sustainable development, and they have done so in different ways depending on their approach. I will show you 3 definitions of sustainable development. This definition is probably the best known. It states, a sustainable development meets the needs of the present generation without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their needs. It was first published in a UN report from 1987, and it was called the Brundtland Report after its main author, Gro Harlem Brundtland, former Prime Minister of Norway. This definition is so widespread and well known that in many textbooks on the subject it is referred to as the definition of sustainable development. But it is important to remember that there is no single definition of sustainable development that everybody would agree on. And each definition of such a concept must always be based on a certain position and can therefore be criticized. The Brundtland definition has been criticized for being vague. What do we mean with needs, for example? Do we mean a fundamental right to food and shelter? Or do we include the right to healthcare and education? And if so, at what level should those be guaranteed? Needs can be very different for different people, and it is important to distinguish between survival needs and wants. Such things must be specified before the Brundtland definition is useful for any practical sustainability work. It should also be noted that the Brundtland report's definition of sustainable development is strongly anthropocentric. It puts people's needs first. Nature's role is defined primarily to provide people with the necessary natural resources to satisfy their needs. Protecting nature is important, but the reason for it is to provide people with what they need. now and in the future. Obviously, that position is criticized by those who assume an ecocentric viewpoint. This is another definition of the concept of sustainable development, or rather the preconditions for a sustainable society. It comes from an organization called the Natural Step, which has defined 4, as they call it, system conditions that must be satisfied for a sustainable society. They claim that in a sustainable society, nature is not subject to systematically increasing 1. Concentrations of substances extracted from the Earth's crust, meaning, for example, that carbon extracted from coal mines must not end up in the atmosphere as carbon dioxide. 2. Concentrations of substances produced by society, meaning, for example, that drugs that we have produced to cure illness must not end up in our waters. And 3. Degradation by physical means, meaning, for example, that forests should not be cut down to build cities or highways or limestone mines. And the 4th condition is that in that society, people are not subject to conditions that systematically undermine their capacity to meet their needs. And indeed, the 4th system condition is very similar to the Brundtland definition. But if we are ignoring that initially and look at the 3 others, we can conclude that they are basically assuming an ecocentric perspective. We should not affect the natural systems by conducting any human activities. Some have criticized the natural step system conditions for being too dogmatic. And another criticism of the natural step system conditions is that the 4th condition is based on an anthropocentric perspective, while the first 3 are based on an ecocentric perspective. And they are therefore not fitting together from a strictly philosophical perspective. They are in a sense, they are self-contradictory. The criticism has in both cases been met with asserting that the system conditions were never meant to be interpreted dogmatically, but as a source of inspiration in defining aspects that should be taken into account. This is a 3rd definition, not strictly a definition of sustainable development, but rather a concept known as an ecological footprint. However, sustainable development can be defined from this concept by claiming that for a sustainable development, our combined ecological footprint must be smaller than a certain size. The definition of an ecological footprint is the amount of land and water area a human population would hypothetically need to provide the resources required to support itself and to absorb its wastes given prevailing technology. This definition is essentially based on an anthropocentric position. The claim is also based on a need for an accounting or indicator scheme by which to measure sustainability. According to the ecological footprint measuring scheme, our combined ecological footprint exceeds the total surface of the planet Earth by about 50%. And if everyone would live like the average European or American, we would need 3 Earths to supply the entire world's population. This approach, some people argue, claim excessively the dark green perspective. This is admittedly not something that follows directly by the definition, but the way it is often interpreted, this way of reasoning leads to the conclusion that we must reduce our energy usage, reduce consumption, and live a more resource-restricted life. Representatives, mainly from the bright green paradigm, has criticized this approach and argued that it is necessary to promote a bright vision of the future that is not characterized by restraint. They believe that if energy resources and other natural resources were produced in a sustainable way, we would be able to continue increasing consumption, which in many ways would result in a richer and better life for most people. So, why are there so many definitions? which is correct and which is best. Obviously, one can argue for sustainable development in different ways, depending on what perspective you have. When it comes to concrete issues, we often find that different people have different opinions. Examples of questions that are often debated in a sustainability context are nuclear power. Those who argue that we should have nuclear power tend to use sustainability arguments, as well as those who argue against. Another example is GMO, the use of genetically modified organisms. Whether people are for or against, they tend to use sustainability arguments. Different opinions are a direct result of different values. And values are in turn a result of different basic beliefs, ideologies, and the fact that people associate themselves with different stakeholders. Furthermore, it is basically difficult to balance various aspects of sustainability, as they are often measured on different scales. The world consists of complex systems that are not always easy to fully grasp. And therefore, responses to sustainability issues usually are not black or white, and there is often no clear right or wrong answer. But, and this is one of the key insights in this lecture, that does not mean that the answer does not matter. Sometimes you hear the claim that everyone is entitled to their own opinion, and that all opinions are equal. But of course, this is completely wrong. An opinion is only worth something if it can be justified with arguments that are correct, logical, and rational. You often hear arguments in debates about sustainability-related issues that are not factually correct. For sustainable development, it is important that more and more people become better informed and that more debaters get better in piercing their opponents' arguments if those are factually or substantially incorrect. But on the other hand, having said that, it may very well be the case that in a given issue, two debaters both are right. They may still have different opinions in their views, if their views are based on different perspectives. This is actually quite in order. All people need not think alike and will not feel the same. Since the issues related to sustainable development to a large extent and very often basically are value issues, which you then may think differently about. The public debate and the ability to discuss these issues is of immense importance. For a sustainable development, it is imperative to learn about these issues, to be factually well informed, but also to accept that there are different perspectives on these issues. It is necessary to be able to meet around those differences and find a solution. Certainly not one that all would agree is the best one, but still a solution that most people can accept. There exists a number of different types of conflicts of interests in the world. They may be conflicts of interest between various countries or groups of countries, for example, between industrialized and developing countries. There can also be conflicts of interest between different targets or goals, so-called conflicting objectives. Those can, for example, be conflicts between short-term goals and long-term goals. Conflicts of interest can also arise between different groups, interests, or special interests in society. The existence of conflicts of interest is not something evil, and they are not something that we can wish away. However, it is important that we can deal with these conflicts in a constructive way. In fact, they can even make the world a better and richer place if we allow ourselves to see other views than our own as an asset when we discuss and debate these issues. The subject of sustainable development is a broad and holistic topic. It is an attempt to connect completely different areas of knowledge and explain how they affect each other. This means that the topic is very complex and it often includes many different perspectives. Complexity and the existence of different perspectives make many sustainability challenges difficult to manage in practice. What practical solutions that individuals and organizations conclude on as specific sustainability challenges is, at least to some extent, the result of different values and perspectives. Therefore, sustainable development is extensively to characterize as a subject of values. It is important to learn about the subject, learning facts, and to understand the world, but in practical action, it is equally important to understand different perspectives and to respect that different people can come to different conclusions about what they think is the most desirable development.